women's economic equality. I'm privileged to work with an amazing team who has worked so hard to get this project up and running and bring this vision to life. So I want to shout out the Legal Momentum team and especially our Director of Economic Justice, Sahar Kawaja, for leading on this innovative project. We're going to be hearing from her very shortly. But before we get started, I really wanted to thank our distinguished panel of guests and experts and leaders for sharing this important day with us and for sharing your insights and expertise. Really could not have done it without your support and partnership. Thank you so much. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, Dr. Childers, and Catherine. Thank you so much for being here. I know everyone is excited to get started. I am. I definitely want to hear all your insights. But before we dive in, I just wanted to remind people that this is being recorded. So please tell your friends. We will send out the materials at the conclusion of the webinar. We are going to be using the Q&A function for questions. If you have questions, please use that, and we will take them at the end. And I think with that, we can kick it off. So I will turn it over to Sahar. Take it away.
Thank you, Azalea. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being with us today. We have a new resource to introduce and an incredible panel, so I'm going to jump right in. One of the things we have known based on the work that we do is that our economy relies heavily on the critical work, care work, and other forms of work disproportionately carried out by women. At the same time, our economy assigns little to no monetary value to that labor and to the outputs of that labor. What we're left with is a discriminatory and exploitative economic model under which women, largely women of color, are expected to sustain our economy while facing appallingly high rates of economic insecurity, especially when compared to white men. Despite the fact that many of us have been trying to bring visibility to this for decades, we still face a severe underinvestment in women of color, as well as major barriers to enacting laws to reform this broken system. Legal Momentum created our new map, The State of Women's Economic Wellbeing and the Law, as another platform for bringing greater visibility to this problem and to push for broader structural reforms. Before we jump into our discussion, I wanted to walk people through this new resource and run through some of our core takeaways and recommendations. So we're going to put the map up and walk through it. I'll give Maria a moment to share her screen. So let's do our quick walkthrough. The website for the map is womenswellbeingmap.org, and we're going to put that link in the chat. You can also access it on our website, and we'll share it after the event. On the main page, you'll find a clickable map that's colored based on 4 categories of comparative poverty rates for women. So if we scroll down a little bit more, we should be able to see those different comparative rates. If you scroll down further, you'll find a methodology dropdown, which provides information on how the data were compiled. You can click on any state. Let's click on New York. It's where I'm based, no bias there, as an example. And it'll take you to the state page. And essentially what you're going to see is there are 2 tabs at the top. There's an economic well-being snapshot on the left side. That's where you land. And then there's a legal protection snapshot. On the economic well-being snapshot, you're going to see state data comparing women with white men with gender-based breakdowns based on race on the following indicators: poverty rates for women, poverty rates for single mothers, the gender pay gap, women in the minimum wage workforce, women in the tipped wage workforce, and women as essential earners. You can click on the side menu if you want to go to a particular section, or you can just scroll through. And each section has a similar methodology dropdown at the bottom of each section at the end to give you a little bit more details on how the data were compiled for that section. Here I want to take a moment to thank Stephen Stapleton for doing an amazing job working with us to compile the data for this section of the map. Next, if we go back to the top, if you click on the Legal Protections tab, It provides an overview of available state pay protections in the following areas: equal pay, pay transparency, minimum wage, tipped wage, overtime, wage notice and pay frequency requirements, and wage theft protections. The legal tab includes a list of questions about the laws in the state. You can click each question to get basic information about the state law on that issue. On the right-hand side, there's a scorecard that gives you an overview of which protections are available and which ones are not, with a tally at the very top. So you can see the checks and the X's, and then at the top for New York, we have 9 of the 10 protections that we're tracking. Some form of law has been enacted in those areas. I think, for our partners, for example, our equal pay partners, this is hopefully a useful tool for tracking kind of what equal pay laws look like state by state. We go through, some of the ways in which and whether state laws exceed federal protections. We go through whether or not pay transparency protections have been enacted. We've tried to keep it current, but if there's something we missed, please let us know. Now, going back to the main page, you can separately go to the national page. We have a national data and the law button, which similarly gives you national data and legal information in those same categories. If we go back to the main page again, that's where you can access Legal Momentum's executive summary, which goes through an analysis we did of the data in the map and provides a set of key takeaways and recommendations that I'm going to run through. And my colleague's going to put a link to this executive summary in the chat as well. Thank you, Maria, for your help with the walkthrough. Okay. So a lot of work went into this map. It was a big endeavor. So I want to also give a huge thank you to our small but very mighty legal team for all the work you did on this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. A few caveats about the map before I go into takeaways. So the data used represent a survey. They don't capture the full picture. In many circumstances, we did not have large enough sample sizes to come to accurate conclusions. And this was particularly so for American Indian populations, but other racial demographics as well. So in some of the infographics, you will see those bars excluded. This is also to flag that that we need better data collection. And I know many of our partners are working on that piece. We also use slightly different methodologies than some of our partners who lead on these issues. And in these cases, the map is only meant to supplement our partners' analysis and to really bring to light different aspects of the problem. And lastly, assessing gender inequity requires a broad and holistic approach. And we want to recognize that our map only covers pay protections, which are only one essential piece of a much larger conversation hopefully we'll be having today. So moving on to key takeaways, what does the map tell us? So nationally, women are 68% more likely to live in poverty, and women are significantly more likely to live in poverty than white men in every state in the country, with the range being anywhere from 16% more likely in Hawaii at the lowest end to 208% more likely at the highest end in Washington, D.C. Unsurprisingly, poverty rates are especially stark for single mothers and women of color. For example, in Mississippi and Louisiana, half or more than half of single mothers live in poverty. And in Louisiana, 33% of Black women live in poverty compared to 10% of white men. The gender earnings gap persists for women generally, but especially for women of color. This is something we know well, but want to really flag, especially as we move into Latina Equal Pay Day. Latina and or American Indian Alaska Native women in at least 12 states make on average half or less than half than white men earn in those states. Women of color are overrepresented in the minimum wage and tipped wage workforces compared to white men, and their wages are drastically insufficient to meet the rising cost of living. In DC, women are 142% more likely to work a minimum wage job compared to white men in And in many states, Hispanic and Latino women are the most overrepresented in these jobs. This means that raising the minimum wage is critical for women of color. And notably, Washington, D.C. has recognized this and has raised the minimum wage. And they have one of the highest minimum wages, if not the highest in the country at the moment. Most women, 70%, and this is again a deflated figure because we had to pick a percentage, but 70% are essential earners in their household, and we define that as contributing at least 30% of household income, with Black women leading as essential earners. They're at 78%. Our goal here is to really highlight that current disparities are creating severe financial precarity, not just for women, but their children and families, and they're driving intergenerational cycles of poverty and insecurity that also deeply undermine our economy. Women fare the worst in many southern states where labor and anti-discrimination protections are the weakest. Mississippi, for example, has the highest poverty rates for women in the country and is the only state that's failed to enact any of the pay protections tracked in our map. I want to drive home that even in the states with the best figures for women, sizable disparities persist for women of color. In Minnesota, for example, which has one of the lowest poverty rates for women, 29% of Black women live in poverty compared to 6% of white men. And the point here is to stress that we need to be tackling this problem on several fronts. States need to be increasing wages and economic protections for women, but simultaneously need to be proactively addressing the occupational segregation of women of color into lower wage work. We do see progress in terms of states adopting core protections. California, for example, has adopted some form of all of the pay protections tracked in our map. But even in leading states, notable disparities exist, with all states demonstrating an underinvestment in women. We therefore want to call people to action in recognition that adoption of basic pay protections is a baseline, and we need to be pushing for more comprehensive reforms to alleviate the disproportionate gender and race-based poverty rates and other gaps that we're seeing. Because we have limited time, I want to give you all a very surface level sense of some of the core recommendations in our executive summary. I want to start by highlighting the limitations of our official poverty measure, which helps us come to these figures, because I think that's a really good example of how we assign no value to the monumental costs associated with childcare. When calculating poverty rates in this country, we rely on antiquated measures that exclude major costs of living, including childcare. This means we can't even accurately assess poverty for women without updating our official poverty measure. Related to this first point, we need to focus on building a care economy that's not built on the current discriminatory scheme that care should be carried out with little or no pay by women and people of color. This means that we need to budget to eliminate gender and racial discrimination, which includes establishing universal child care and paying care workers well. When policymakers feel compelled to ask us where the money would come from for these reforms, we think they should take a moment and imagine a world where women stop doing this work for free and then prioritize finding that money, because budgeting is about priorities. I'll end with emphasizing that we need to protect all workers, both in terms of wages and our laws. Every worker has a right to earn a wage for their work that they can live on, and we need to be taking concrete steps towards increasing the minimum wage to reflect this reality. Further, labor and anti-discrimination laws should cover every single worker, irrespective of immigration status, irrespective of the industry that people work in, irrespective of the size of the employer, the type of work, because every worker deserves equal protection under our laws. And what we see every day is that exclusions automatically result in opportunities to exploit those workers who are excluded. We include a longer and more detailed list of recommendations with much more in-depth information regarding the takeaways in the executive summary. So I encourage you all to take a look at it. That wraps up my overview of the map. So I'm going to transition to our discussion. As a technical note, panelist bios will be going into the chat. So I close with talking about all the things policymakers aren't doing and need to do. And I want to start this discussion today by hearing from a lawmaker who is actually doing many, if not all, of these things. Legal Momentum has had the privilege and honor to work with Senator Jessica Ramos on legislation to establish pay transparency and to increase and index the minimum wage in New York State, which are only two critical initiatives that Senator Ramos has achieved here. As labor chair, Senator Ramos has enacted and introduced a historic legislative agenda focused on advancing the rights of workers, women of color, and immigrants that reflects the type of bold action necessary to address some of the stark economic and structural inequities we're talking about today. Thank you so much for being with us, Senator.
Thank you for that kind introduction and good afternoon. Buenas tardes, everyone. It is great to be with you. I think first and foremost, I want to congratulate Legal Momentum. Sahar, your team have done incredible work with this map. We do so much work passing these laws and making sure that they're implemented correctly, that having a metric to see the impact so that we know where our work needs to continue is really, really important. You've been amazing partners. You've been amazing partners to me and my team in introducing and passing our salary transparency laws. And it's really, this has been my life's work. I am Latina. I am the daughter of a Colombian immigrant, and I, my whole life, have seen how women are shortchanged, are undermined, are overlooked, and we need laws to keep up with us. So to me, right now there's so much discussion about the Equal Rights Amendment. It's going to be on the ballot this November. And remember, when you do go out to vote, to flip that ballot and answer that question, because we want all aspects of law to recognize our value and the need to move our country forward in a way that reflects that we women are actually a very slight majority of people and should at least have equal footing to men. In New York State, we have been working towards addressing the feminization of poverty in many ways. Aside from the salary transparency law, I've passed legislation to raise the minimum wage and tie it to inflation for the first time in the history of New York State, joining other states and Washington, D.C. to do this. I wanted 2125. That wasn't what was agreed upon with the governor, unfortunately, but we would have beat Washington, D.C. With a high minimum wage that recognizes the high cost of living we're experiencing. I've also done a lot to advance childcare and increase access to families who are living within 500% of the federal poverty line. So now in New York State, we're able to extend childcare subsidies to families of four that make over $80,000 a year. And right now, I'm waiting for the governor to sign my newest childcare law, which is to do away with the minimum wage requirement in New York State to qualify for subsidies, which was crazy. I didn't even know this going into Albany, and now I've been there for over 6 years. This is gonna be my seventh session in January. But in New York State, if you make below minimum wage, you work odds and ends jobs, you're a freelancer of some sort, you're unemployed, you don't qualify for childcare subsidies. So we need everyone to have access to those programs. And we passed paid sick leave for domestic workers, which is really important. I talk a lot about the caring economy and actually how honoring a caring economy, those who take care of children, those who take care of elders, those who do social work and all of the caring in the world, which is of course a labor of love, but our social workers and everyone else need to pay rent too and need to be valued in the work that they do in order to take care of our society. which is why during the pandemic, I passed the $2.1 billion excluded workers fund to recognize that there are just some folks who do a ton of work and can't access unemployment insurance. And that is among many other things like temporary disability reform that we need to do. That is a lot that I just threw out there, I know, but it should give you a sense of the body of law that we're talking about, because there are copious pages of labor law that we've already written, but there is just so much to do in order to right the wrongs of discrimination, right the wrongs of misogyny, right the wrongs of the feminization of poverty. And that should be the signature issue of this generation of hardworking women. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Ramos. And I think it does really give us a flavor of the broad range of laws that we really need to be thinking about to disrupt some of these longstanding inequities. I want to back us up a little bit for a moment. You talked about how you're the proud daughter of Colombian immigrants, and now you represent a lot of Queens where you're working directly to uplift those immigrant families and many of the women we are most concerned about. And based on your experience and your work, can you talk a little bit about, just being out in the community, what you see are some of the key factors that are pushing women into economic security and poverty, and what's keeping us from achieving gender and racial inequity?
Well, that's a really big question. I've lived. I'm born and raised in my district, so I've lived here now for 4 decades. And I've seen that the more things change, the less things change. My parents, my mom crossed the Mexican border to get here, much like the migrants have today. And that was in the 70s. And it was really difficult for my mom at the time to find work in what she wanted to do. She ended up working as a seamstress at a sweatshop in Astoria, 30 plus years ago. And that was the type of work prior to NAFTA and all of those jobs being outsourced, that those were the type of entry points that were available for immigrants into our economy. Nowadays, so much xenophobic rhetoric, and Republicans in general, right? I'm allowed to be partisan, right? Their rhetoric in general and their lack of cooperation, and seeing just how interdependent we are on each other, regardless of papers or not, it's been very difficult to create safe entry points into the economy for migrants. My district, I represent the neighborhoods of Jackson Heights, Corona, East Elmhurst, which is, has been the modern day Ellis Island now, I would argue, for about a century. Migrants arrive here, especially on Roosevelt Avenue, and are very limited in the opportunities that are available to them because of the federal government's lag in passing comprehensive immigration reform, or at the very least work permits. I always say that even if we can't agree what the path to a green card or citizenship looks like, at least give people the dignity of being able to provide for themselves and feel useful. Well, for women, that has often meant that they become street vendors, which is a completely ignored system in New York City, and essentially I was going to say underground economy, but it's very much above ground, and we see it. But it's kind of a shadow economy from the mainstream one. We see how women are exploited in sex work, and there are people holding on to women's passports, and this is prevalent in both the Latino and Asian communities, unfortunately. And there's little action taken to break up those human trafficking rings that we're seeing. We see people, of course, enter the hospitality sector, which is very hard work, which can be low wage work. It's definitely tipped work. And so there is less stability or financial stability that can be offered to these folks. To me, allowing them an entry point into the economy is crucial to keeping everyone safe, and making sure that people are able to provide for themselves is just good for everyone else around them. So those are some of the things that I've been seeing here, and I really wish we had a city government who could better liaise with the White House and the federal government to make them see how desperate we are for them to function and also pass laws that can help us.
And it's great, you covered so many of the core industries where you see just it plays out in different ways, but I think women end up in the same kind of situation where they're dealing with such deep financial insecurity. They're doing such essential work for our families, our communities, our economy. I wanted to just ask one last question, just thinking about, when we think about policymaking and legislation, there's kind of the legislative piece of really enacting or putting in place the infrastructure. There's also the budgetary piece of making sure we're funding these things. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes when we talk about universal childcare, people ask, but where are we going to get the money for that? And I think it's a very frustrating question from my perspective, because again, I feel like it's easy to ask when you're ignoring the fact that your economy is built on the backs of women, and you're not giving
Yeah.
any value to the work that they're doing behind the scenes. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of how we shift that thinking on how we budget.
I think I don't, I think that as working class people, sometimes we can be shy about asking for money that we deserve. And in a state so rich as New York State, where we have, about 130, give or take a different month, 130 billionaires, I think it's okay. It should be okay to tax their unrealized capital gains. And for folks who don't know what that means, it means that nowadays the ultra rich aren't just, putting all of their money in bank accounts and putting their money into stocks and those type of financial investments. They are buying yachts, they are buying pieces of artwork and things that appreciate externally, right, off the grid, if you will, without having to pay any taxes on that appreciation. I believe that that's unfair. I've long now held a bill to tax unrealized capital gains in the state Senate for billionaires. And I have to say, shout out to Vice President Kamala Harris. She has actually introduced as part of her platform a plan to tax a plan to tax unrealized capital gains for those who earn more than $100 million. So dare I say, Vice President Harris is to my left on this issue, and there should be no reason why we don't get this done in New York State, because we estimate that in the first year, it would generate approximately $25 billion. That is money that can seriously go towards building out a system of childcare that is good, high quality, free childcare, universal childcare for every child to have a safe place to be in New York State. This should be the win of our lifetime if we so choose, but we must create the political will to pass those types of bills here in New York State and hopefully at the federal level.
Well, thank you, Senator, for being just a true leader and partner in this fight. You can be partisan, but we're going to keep it nonpartisan on our end based on our status. But I'm going to open up the conversation to our other incredible panelists with very brief introductions. Today, we have Dr. Caitlin Henderson, who's a senior researcher at Oxfam, where she has been the lead researcher and author of Oxfam's Best States to Work Index, which is a look at how states treat workers and working families in the United States. And we're going to share more information about that index in the chat. And Caitlin's been an incredible partner with us. We have Dr. Chandra Childers, who is a senior policy and economic analyst with the Economic Analysis and Research Network, EARN, at the Economic Policy Institute. Her work is primarily focused on local policy research and advocacy in the Southern United States. And Catherine Hinshaw manages the policy portfolio for Justice for Migrant Women, covering issues of economic security, anti-gender-based violence, and migration. She leads the organization's campaigns for equal pay, anti-harassment, know your rights, and expanding health and safety in the world of work. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today, for sharing your expertise with us today. We are so grateful. I'm going to start with you, Caitlin. You recently authored and issued a really important report and map for Oxfam on the crisis of low wages across our country. Can you talk to us about some of the key findings, how women specifically are impacted by our current wage laws and practices, and then lastly, kind of what reforms we need to prioritize to address this crisis?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Saher. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really especially excited because I feel like the map that Legal Momentum has released today speaks so eloquently to the research that we released in July, the crisis of low wages, that also has an interactive map component. And the images and the maps that you showed really reflect a lot of the findings that we have as well. But to zoom out a little bit and talk about that research at a national level, we were really wanting to understand who are low wage workers in the United States, which we define as anyone making less than $17 an hour. And what we found was almost 1 in 4 workers in the US are making low wages. About 23% of workers in the United States earn low wages, which translates to over 39 million people. But just as you were mentioning when you were giving a presentation of Legal Momentum's new research, this has a much bigger and disproportionate impact on women. One of the ways that we see women trapped in cyclical poverty is due often to low wages. So if we're looking specifically at women, we find that nearly 28% of women in the United States earn low wages if we look at women sort of as a collective. But then when we take an interdisciplinary, or excuse me, an approach looking at both race and gender, an intersectional approach as we call it, those numbers jump quite a bit. So if we're looking specifically at, for example, Black women at the national level, we're seeing that nearly 35% of Black women are earning low wages. And again, this is at the national level. We also have data specific to all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And as you might imagine, those numbers do change quite a bit when you're looking at certain states. And if you're looking at Latino women, it's nearly 40% of Latino women in the US are earning low wages. And again, those numbers change and get much higher if you're looking at certain states, especially those states that are relying on the federal minimum wage, which hasn't changed in 15 years. It's still $7.25. And you mentioned earlier, Saher, tipped wage workers, which tend to overwhelmingly and disproportionately be women, but especially women of color. We also looked at tipped wage workers in our data, and we saw that over 50% of tipped wage workers earn low wages. So our data looks at the full demographic breakdown of low wage workers, including their race, their gender, their parental status, their age, and whether or not they're tipped workers. And those are some of the really important stats because, as you were talking earlier about single parents and single mothers in particular, it's really crucial to remember that often single mothers and single parents are low wage workers, despite being essential not only to their families, but to their economy, to our economy, because of the roles that they hold. A lot of these women and parents are working as caregivers. And yet we find that 42% of single parents in the United States are earning low wages. There is a very common misconception in the United States that low wage or even minimum wage workers are teenagers or people who have an after school job, and that's just absolutely not the case. The vast majority of low wage workers in the United States are adults. They tend to be parents. They are overwhelmingly and disproportionately women and women of color, but they are absolutely essential to our economy. And I love that you were really talking, Sahara, about childcare and how childcare needs to be considered more seriously in calculations of poverty. Childcare workers are essential. They are also underpaid, as we know. And so often we we were not specific to sectors in our research outside of tipped workers, but we do know from research done by organizations such as the National Women's Law Center that childcare workers are almost always represented as low wage workers. Again, someone earning less than $17 an hour. The same can be said of elder care workers or workers for adults with disabilities. And these are some of the most crucial industries in our country, and yet still very much underpaid. And what this data really shows us is the long legacies of occupational segregation. The fact that women are overrepresented in low wage workforces is the reflection of long legacies of gender and racial discrimination that undervalue the work of women, of people of color, of women of color. And as a historian, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this also reflects the legacies and the histories of labor law that were really established in the 1930s that with intention really wrote out communities of color and especially women and women of color when creating protections including the minimum wage. Domestic workers very notoriously were not included in minimum wage laws, which in the 1930s, when these laws were established, were Black women majority. We're a majority of Black women, especially in the South. And I know my colleague, Dr. Childers, will be talking a little bit more about the impact in the South. But so our focus was really looking at who is most impacted. But as you say, Seher, there are policy solutions and there are easy answers, which is the good news. It just is a question of getting momentum behind making some of these changes. So if we were simply to raise the minimum wage at the federal level, or even at the state level, that is one of the quickest and most direct ways to address issues of poverty. It doesn't solve for poverty, but it certainly makes levels of poverty drop down. So raising the wage is an easy and key policy solution, but more than that, we need to eliminate the sub-minimum tipped wage. Tipped wage workers, in some cases, in many states, are still stuck at earning $2.13 an hour, which is the federal tipped wage. It hasn't changed in over 30 years, and that is well below a poverty wage. And beyond that, we also need to end all exclusions to minimum wages. There are certain workers that are still not included in minimum wages, including some teens, some workers with disabilities, some domestic workers, farm workers, which is a hugely important community that is the reason we have food on our table. So there are certain policy solutions that are very straightforward and just require the sort of political will behind them. But as speaking as someone who works at a nonpartisan nonprofit institution, I will say with full transparency that raising the minimum wage is a very bipartisan reality. It is something people support. Most people agree that if you work hard, you deserve to earn a fair wage. And it is long since time for us to raise the minimum wage. Certainly, that has lost so much of its buying power. So I'll pause there, but I'm so excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Katie. I really love that you brought so much context to how so many of these practices that have pushed women and people of color into these low wage occupations are really grounded in discriminatory policies and practices and schemes. And I think that's something that we don't shed light on nearly enough. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chandra to kind of hopefully elaborate some more on some of what we're thinking about here. Chandra, your research has really brought visibility to what you refer to in your work as the underperformance of Southern states, as well as the magnified disparities for women, particularly Black women. And this is something we're trying to highlight too with the map and some of what we're putting forth in the executive summary is that we're just seeing very extreme numbers in states like Mississippi and Louisiana and other Southern states. Can you talk a bit about some of the trends you've identified in this regard, what drives these trends, and what we need to do to reverse course?
Yes. So thank you, first of all, for having me. I also would like to echo being honored to be able to join this panel and join this discussion. And so in terms of what I'm seeing, so several things have stood out to me in the work that I'm doing. One, I consistently find that Black women, they have higher rates of labor force participation than women from other racial and ethnic backgrounds. And as mentioned earlier, I find that a larger share, their earnings make up a larger share of their total household earnings. And so this to me highlights just how crucial their earnings are for their family's economic well-being. And then when we look at women of color more generally, so when we look at the pay of Black, Hispanic, and other women of color, they're paid less than their male counterparts across the board. And they're also paid less than white women and white men. So when we look at that, we see that a big part of that is occupational segregation, as has been mentioned. They hold jobs that are less likely to provide them with health insurance. It's less likely to provide them with a 401k match. It's less likely to provide them with paid sick days, with paid family and medical leave. And so these are all benefits that workers need in order to have greater economic security. And the fact that they lack these, it means that they face much higher economic insecurity, higher rates of poverty, as you already mentioned. And this is especially true for women across the South. So while this is bad nationally, it's particularly bad across the South. And one reason it's so much worse is that across the South, many of the states, they have adopted this model that we refer to as the Southern Economic Development Model. And this is an economic development model specifically designed to keep wages as low as possible. And that includes suing the federal government if they try to raise wages for contractors. It means few regulations on businesses. And what that means is that businesses then are free to ignore the well-being of workers. It leaves them vulnerable to dangerous workplaces. We've seen workers be harmed. They're open to wage theft and other harms without regulations. It means that the tax systems are regressive. So what we see in these states is that the lower earning workers, disproportionately women, that these workers are paying a larger share of their income to taxes compared with wealthier and corporate interests in these states. And it means a weak safety net. And what that means is that for women, again, if their employers are not going to give them paid time off, then they're also in states that don't provide like paid time off or paid family and medical leave. It means they don't have the supports. If they lose a job, it's much more difficult for them to access those benefits. It means they don't have the supports that they need across these states. And then it also means that the lawmakers are joining with their employers to fight their efforts to join unions, for them to come together to collectively bargain and try to improve their own well-being, to improve their job quality themselves. And so across the South, what we see is, states consistently passing right to work laws. We see states starting to pass laws now that if a company does want to acknowledge their workers' efforts to bargain collectively, they will punish the company for acknowledging that. And I think a key part of this is understanding not just that this model exists, but how this model developed in the first place. It's put forward today as a way to generate job growth and prosperity, but it can't do that because that's not what it was designed to do. It actually emerged after emancipation, when Black Southerners could no longer be forced to work without compensation. And the Southern plantation, they still needed, for example, domestic workers to care for children and to clean their homes. They still needed agricultural work. And many people may not realize, but Black women also served as laborers in this agricultural world. They still needed service workers. They needed people to prepare and serve food, but they also still did not want to pay fair wages. So that's when we begin to see the adoption of ways to get around, to be able to extract labor as cheaply as possible. Tipped workers has already come up in the discussion. But, we see the sharecropping develop. We see tipped workers being, forced to rely upon tips rather than being paid. And the Fair Labor Standards Act has also been brought up. But we can tell from that the goal really was to essentially continue extracting labor without fair compensation, because when the Fair Labor Standards Act was proposed, and this, again, it set the 40-hour work week, the minimum wages, it set overtime, And Southern lawmakers would only agree to support this legislation if those specific jobs that Black women and men did, agriculture, domestic work, and tipped workers, were excluded from the protections of the law. And so the intent is clear. And what we see is stretching from before, emancipation, stretching through the Jim Crow until today, these jobs still continue to be held primarily by Black, Hispanic, and other women of color, many immigrants, and they lack the protections that they need. They're paid low wages, and that's a key reason these jobs tend to be devalued. And I did, as has been mentioned, across the South, but this is more particular to the South. We see that across most Southern states, tipped workers are still paid as little as $2.13 by their employer. But in many states outside the South, they have raised their tipped minimum wage or eliminated it altogether. So it's not just, that it has to be that way, because we see many states eliminate this. They could also raise their regular minimum wage. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, and what applies in most Southern states is $7.25 an hour. This wage has been stuck there since 2009. And every time I hear discussion about inflation, but no willingness to raise the minimum wage. And so we know that today that minimum wage has less purchasing power than any time since 1956. So this, we really do need to get that wage up. And states can raise their wages, even if the federal government is stuck. States can. 30 states in DC have raised their minimum wage above the federal minimum, and raising it to $17 for all workers and eliminating the tipped wage would really improve the lives of all workers, but especially women and Black women in particular, who are the most likely to be paid at or below that minimum wage. And I would finally like to add, perhaps one of the more important things, not more than raising the minimum wage, but it's supporting workers when they want to join together with their coworkers in a union. Again, this would empower workers. It would allow them to demand better job quality for themselves. And the data are clear that unionized workers, they have better earnings, they have better benefits, they don't face the same racial and gender wage gaps. So there's one way to tackle that issue right there. And there's a whole host of other benefits that come from that. So I think that when we look across the South, you can really see the origins of many of these, the devaluation of these jobs, but you can also look outside the South to see how they can begin to remedy and change things for workers, especially women of color.
That was amazing. Thank you. I think it was so useful to hear just both about kind of the trends as they're exacerbated in the South, but that kind of exists across the board, but also for you to dive deeper into the Southern economic model, for us to just really hear about the nuances of how that plays out, because I think we really need to be thinking more concretely about what we do in that regard. It's been too long. It shouldn't have existed in the first place. And so thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over now to Catherine. So Catherine, Justice for Migrant Women has been at the forefront of bringing light to severe vulnerabilities that migrant women face, predominantly Latinas face in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the barriers and disparities that migrant women face, particularly in the middle of the country? We've talked a little bit about the South. I know we've talked about New York. How is this impacting their economic security and our economy? And what are some of the priorities for reform?
Thanks, Sahir, and thanks echoing my gratitude for being a part of this conversation today. And it's also really timely. I know you mentioned at the top that we're just a few weeks away from Latina Equal Pay Day. And today is also Disabled Women's Equal Pay Day and International Equal Pay Day. So congratulations on the map, and the resources that the other panelists have shared today are super relevant for this timing. So it's good to be here today. I did want to contextualize where Justice for Migrant Women kind of lands in this conversation. We are headquartered in Fremont, Ohio, and we serve specifically migrant and rural women. And many of the people who we serve are indeed immigrant women. And we also serve and are in community with women who migrate for work across state lines and across county lines who would not necessarily consider themselves immigrants. And so I think that's just important as I talk a little bit about the barriers and challenges that the community who we're serving is facing. We're also situated from the perspective of local grassroots organizing, but within a larger national and global context, because for the folks who we work with, the challenges they're experiencing really need to be considered at all of these levels and not just one region in particular. And I want to get a little bit more specific about that constituency, and I'm really grateful that farm worker women and domestic workers have already been brought up numerous times today, because we work super closely with farm worker women and other women who are employed in agriculture, employed across the food supply chain, domestic workers in Fremont. There, in addition to farm work, there are a number of factories who produce food, the food that we put on our table. And so this is who we are in community with. And we hear directly from their experiences that they are experiencing wage theft, that challenges include a lack of health insurance, a lack of paid leave. None of these things are surprises. We also hear of numerous instances of sexual harassment and workplace harassment that includes different forms of sexual violence. And that all of these experiences combined are really contributing to negative mental health outcomes. And that's something that I did want to bring up, because in addition to some of these other structural pieces that exist, and time and time again, we're hearing in listening sessions and from our organizing team on the ground that the negative mental health outcomes are also contributing to their experiences in the workplace and being able to really build power together. The other thing that I would mention is the unique challenges or other unique challenges that migrating for work poses. So particularly looking at farm worker women and other migrant women who rely on employer provided transportation and housing, that creates this relationship that leaves employees really vulnerable to a variety of forms of exploitation, particularly when they have to rely on their employer so that they have a place to live. And in rural communities, a way sometimes to move around the town that they're in. So if they're lacking transportation and that's provided by the employer, not only does it make it difficult for them to get the food that they need or supplies that they need, because it's not necessarily easy to just go around the corner to the store and get what they need. So it puts them in a particularly and uniquely vulnerable position that requires that they maintain the relationship with that employer, even if there's harm being done. And I won't go into this too much further, because we've already talked a lot about the fact that this sits in the backdrop of the racist lack of basic labor protections for the communities that we're serving. And the fact that to this day, the folks who we work with do not have the federal right to organize, to receive overtime pay. And another thing that's really important to mention is that for many migrant and rural women who are working in places that are of fewer than 15 employees, they're also not protected under federal anti-discrimination laws. And so until this basic lack of protections under federal law is remedied, on top of the experiences that already come with living and working in rural communities, such as limited access to resources, oftentimes including language barriers, we're really not going to see economic security for migrant and rural women who are, as has been named, absolutely essential to our community, to our society, and our economy. And it really impacts all of us when we are not all able to thrive and be healthy and safe in the workplace. So that's a little bit of where we're coming into this from. I also mentioned International Equal Pay Day earlier, and for us, it's really important that we consider how the economic security of women in other countries is impacting migration. and consider what is it that we're doing here in the United States to ensure that when they arrive, because people are going to migrate, that's just the nature of humanity, that they're arriving in a way that allows them to have a healthy and a safe workplace that pays them well. And a framework that we're really looking at is through the International Labor Conventions, International Labor Organizations Convention 190. And that's the first international treaty to recognize the right of everyone to a world of work that's free from violence and free from harassment. And that includes gender-based violence and harassment. And this framework is super important for the communities that we serve because it expands who is included in workplace protections. It defines gender-based violence and harassment in a way that's really helpful for working women, particularly migrant women. And it also expands what the workplace means. I was really energized to hear the work that Senator Ramos is doing, as she mentioned, migrant women, and particularly folks who are street vendors and others in the informal economy. If we were to be able to implement this framework of Convention 190, it would include people in the informal economy. It would identify being a street vendor as a place of work. It would be included in the world of work, and that would provide so much more protection than already exists for some of the folks who are crucial parts of our economy, but are not recognized in such in terms of protections and pay. So the piece that we have prioritized that kind of begins to align some of these principles of Convention 190 is the Be Heard in the Workplace Act, because it really does make some of those connections between economic security, between violence and harassment, and would expand who is protected under federal law in terms of anti-discrimination. So that's perhaps something that is important to consider. Although it's an international framework, there's really specific ways that we can integrate those principles at the national, state, and local level. And it really would enhance the ways that the communities we're serving are able to access healthy and safe workplaces free from gender-based violence and free from harassment. I did want to mention one other piece, and I will kind of just quickly acknowledge that because I think it's important to name the Farm Bill as we're talking about economic security and being situated in the Midwest and also other parts of the country that are rural. One really critical piece that we're working on moving right now is actually related to mental health funding for agricultural workers. Right now, this program, the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network, it does exist and has been funded under the Farm Bill for the past 5 years. But what the data shows is that the funds that are allocated by the Department of Agriculture are not actually going to farm worker women. They're not going to women of color who are working in agriculture. They are largely going to white men. And so what we're really working on is ensuring that those funds first are reauthorized in the Farm Bill, but then later are specifically going towards farm worker women, to agricultural workers, to people who work in agriculture that are not often afforded the protections that we mentioned earlier. And the reason this mental health piece is so crucial is because of the lack of access to health insurance and some of these other basic infrastructure pieces that are lacking would provide this mental health support as a tool for people to be able to build power, because that's something that we have really heard from folks that as we are working to change these systems and structures, it's important that we have the tools to be able to connect with each other and have mental health access to be able to feel that we can really kind of continue that organizing and continue that power building around healthier, safer, and better workplaces.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was so rich, and I thank you for covering so many critical pieces from kind of mental health, ILO 190. I'm so glad you brought that up, to be heard, to, farm worker bill. So I think we've learned so much. We have a little bit of time, so I want to kind of turn it over, maybe for like, does it make sense to do a quick, like maybe 2 to 3 minute follow-up question for everyone? Do we have time for that, Azalea? Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to you, Catherine, since you were just talking about some of this. I know sometimes, in a lot of the immigrant women we're talking to, one of the issues that comes up significantly is just the fear of retaliation. Sometimes laws don't apply, sometimes laws do apply. And even in those contexts, it's really hard to get workers to decide to come forward to use some of the protections that are available because there's such a strong fear of retaliation, and a very realistic one, based on both economic vulnerability and immigration status. And I know you've been putting out Know Your Rights materials, and we've shared some of that with the participants. And I was curious as to how, if you have thoughts on how do we overcome some of this? Can we overcome some of this? Can training people, can driving knowledge about the availability of rights help, as we do more work to expand our laws so that they do cover workers regardless of immigration status?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the kind of important pieces as we look at what it really means to engage in policy work is the fact that oftentimes the implementation side can be left behind. And so we can, oftentimes really energize around a bill or an executive action. And it's so important to celebrate those wins when we have them at all levels. And then it's also important to take those wins and ensure that the community is integrated, not only just when the win happens, as a full part of the policymaking process. And then once we have those successes, make sure that we're dedicating time, resources, and energy into ensuring that those new laws or even existing laws that have been slightly amended actually gets out into the community. Because if a policy exists but no one knows about it, then it's not effective. And so that's part of what we've been trying to do as well, not just kind of pushing forward on these advocacy pieces that I just mentioned, but we created a Know Your Rights booklet in English, Spanish, and French with a lens towards migrant and rural women based on the conversations that we've had with folks. What are some of the things that are coming up for people? And as we're pushing for more inclusive laws, how are we making sure that people are aware of the laws that do exist that they can take advantage of now? And making sure that as a nonprofit organization who is in community with folks, that we're a safe landing place for them to come forward and say, I'm experiencing this, and then using these Know Your Rights resources to provide them with various opportunities for kind of remedying the situation based on what it is that we hear from them that they need, and not assuming that, well, just because this law is in place, like you mentioned, immigration status, maybe it's not the best avenue based on their situation. And so we have to really look at the situation as a whole and recognize that people are not coming forward to us with single issues, analyzing what are the opportunities under the existing law, and what is it that this person is really conveying to us that they want to be done. And our kind of strategy around the Know Your Rights campaign is to be able to put this information out in the world in a way that people can receive it, not just reading it, but also videos. We're being really strategic around the different places that we're showing these materials. We've been doing a free farmers market in Fremont, Ohio. And so as we're providing some, direct services to folks, we're also making sure that this information is reaching them, and at least begin a conversation and awareness if that is something that people are interested in. And then for the folks who are already engaged, making sure that they feel comfortable and have the resources to share with their community and with their peers, with their friends and family, because that's also a crucial part of the organizing that we're doing.
That's amazing and such important work. Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to go back in reverse order. Dr. Childers, I want to talk about, again, return to this idea of the Southern economic model. It's interesting. Sometimes we complain in New York when we're trying to push to address it, whether we're trying to litigate on discrimination or use our labor laws. And then when we try to do some of that in the South, we realize like the infrastructure that we're used to having up here some of it doesn't, those types of laws don't even exist here. We tried to bring a public accommodations anti-discrimination case in Mississippi and realize that's not a law that exists in Mississippi. So I was curious if you had thoughts on like how do we mobilize workers in the South, and oftentimes workers are siloed into their industries, into their ethnic groups, their racial groups. Do you have thoughts on how we mobilize workers in the South to tackle the Southern economic model, to dismantle it, take it down?
Yeah, well, the way that we approach this, and I'll kind of share two things. One is the way we approach this is we partner with, in the States, there are research and advocacy groups. We partner with those, with grassroots groups, and with labor groups that are already working to organize people within communities. And we can work with them to provide support. And also, since they're in those communities, they know as Catherine was saying, what these communities want, what they need, how they want things approached. And they also know the barriers better than we do. And so we provide them support, and then they do that work on the ground. And like I said, by building those alliances with the advocacy research, grassroots, you are then bringing in. And then we are also seeing the workers themselves are really beginning to realize that the power that they have. And so, a lot of I mentioned unions. A lot of unions focus on specific groups. But one of the things we're seeing across the South, like the Union of Southern Service Workers, they're organizing across, like they're not organizing one workplace. It's not a traditional model, but it's a way of representing a large swath of low-wage workers and fighting. And as you see wins happening across the region, it's motivating other people to begin to look and say, like, oh, wait, we keep hearing how unions are bad, but look, they just, you can look to, the big three and the wins there. And then you get this win over here, and you see them raising wages to keep people from unionizing. And then people realize, like, oh, wait a minute, that's not a bad thing. That's a way for us to be treated more fairly, to get a voice in our workplace and to have a safer workplace. So those are kind of two models that I think about that kind of build up that is beginning to build that infrastructure. There's a long way to go, but.
Well, thank you so much for bringing us back to the unions and the grassroots community building. I think the more we think about this, the more we realize it's really where it's at, and we need to kind of keep prioritizing those and doing work that way. Caitlin, I want to turn it back to you. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the Best States to Work Index and kind of some of what you see there. And I know it's a big question with a little amount of time. So whatever you can top level, whatever you can tell us.
Yeah, so every year around Labor Day, Oxfam releases what we call the Best States to Work Index, which looks at 27 policies across three big themes: wages, worker protections, rights to organize. And we rank all 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico on whether or not they have these policies in support of low-wage workers and working families. So what's exciting is a lot of what Dr. Childers has been mentioning and a lot of what Catherine has been mentioning are policies that we have in our index at the state level, because these are all policies that are either insufficient or totally missing at the federal level. Whether we're looking at what is the minimum wage, what is the tipped wage, what are wage protections for farm workers, is there a domestic workers bill of rights, what are the rights to organize like at the state level. And to sort of dovetail on what Dr. Childers was talking about, we do see that the lowest ranking states are predominantly in the South. And a lot of that has to do with their reliance on federal standards of worker protections, wages, and rights to organize, or in some cases, the undermining of federal standards. Mississippi has the unique situation of being one of the few states that has a does not have an equal pay protection. In fact, theirs has undermined the federal standard, the piece of policy that they passed. And we work really closely with farm worker justice, for example, to really pay attention to what kind of policies exist at the state level in support of farm workers, some of the issues that Catherine has been touching on. So I know the link to that resources in the chat, and it does include sort of a laundry list of policies that both states and the federal government can pass to really improve supports for low-wage workers and working families. And it really is, the goal is to inspire a race to the top. It is to demonstrate to states, your neighboring state, or maybe a state a little bit further away, has proven that these policies, when passed, really do work. We know the union difference, as what Dr. Childers was mentioning. We know the impact of higher wages on issues like poverty, because what we do is, sometimes people think that labor laws exist in a vacuum, but our research also looks at how these our rankings and our scores and our index correlate to measures of well-being. And the truth is that where states have more of these policies in support of workers are states that have better measures of well-being, such as there are lower rates of poverty, there are lower instances of food insecurity, there is higher median household income where there's more labor policies in support of workers. So these things are all so intrinsically connected. I love that Catherine was mentioning ILO standards. Those are great models as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us. There's a lot of resources for what we can improve on. And a lot of states have demonstrated how it's possible. And New York is one of those states that has demonstrated really exciting progress, first state to pass a domestic workers' bill of rights. So I think there's a lot that can keep us hopeful and a lot that can show us what states, communities, localities, and also the federal government can do to make life better, but especially for working women. And you haven't mentioned it, Sahar, but I will mention that the Legal Momentum has a really awesome Working Women Bill of Rights that we reference in the Best States to Work Index, which is very targeted to working women. It is an awesome resource of legal rights and enforcement, as Catherine was mentioning. So hopefully this webinar has just been an opportunity to share resources for folks to bring back to their communities.
Well, I couldn't have wrapped it up better, Katie, myself. And thank you for mentioning our Bill of Rights. Azalea, I know we only have a couple minutes left, and there are a couple questions. I apologize that so for those who want to kind of stay on for a couple more minutes, Azalea, do we have questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Thank you so much again to the panel. I know we have only 2 more minutes, but the first question was, there's an interesting tension in some victim advocacy organizations in that advocates are often paid low wages for their important and skilled work, and some organizations have resisted their desire to organize, form labor unions, and engage in collective bargaining. Do you have observations or insights to offer about this particular dynamic? And I will say that it's not just victim advocacy organizations. I feel like a lot of human service organizations generally have been caught up in this issue. So any thoughts on that?
I would just say that there's many instances of that, and I would never deny it at all. I'm very proud to say that my particular organization is unionized, that we're members of SEIU Local 500. I know EPI, the organization Dr. Childers works for, also is unionized. So I think there's some, again, models that other organizations can rely on and can refer to as what can be done. And the nice thing is, for organizations looking to organize for their workers, all of our collective bargaining agreements are open and available online. It's a public resource. So for any worker or organization that's interested or curious about that, there's a bunch of also great resources. Again, would never deny that is the case in a lot of spaces, but there's some good examples, good models that others can seek to really emulate and to use as an example of what can and should be done.
Thank you. That gives me hope. And then the next question, well, it's more of a comment. It's from Hannah Beth Jackson. She says, I wrote California's 2015 Equal Pay Act and other legislation dealing with expanding paid family leave, sexual harassment protections, etc., as California state senator. And she just offered up her contact information if you have any assistance. Hannah Beth Jackson at gmail.com. And we can send a follow-up email to everyone that is attending the webinar today with information and resources.
Well, we are at 2:15. I just want to again thank our panelists for such an amazing conversation. There was just so much good information there. Thank you for your time, for the amazing work that you're doing. And as Azalea mentioned, we are going to be following up with the resources that we discussed today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.